Okay, so I think we should be starting. All right, so our next speaker is Puneet Agrawal from Microsoft AI and Research.
Hello, everyone. My name is Puneet. Thank you for attending this talk. Today, I'll talk about how user growth and research could potentially go hand in hand. While I will be the one talking, I talk on behalf of these wonderful people on the screen here, a very diverse and bright set of people. So about me, I work in the AI and R division at Microsoft in India. I founded Microsoft's Ruuh.ai, about which I will talk in this talk. And then earlier I had created Personality of Cortana, which was Microsoft's personal assistant. So I have a lot of interest in like persona-related AI and how personality can be defined and so on and so forth. So about Ruuh. Ruuh was launched in February of 2017. So last week was her second birthday. It's a chat bot, and it has had over 300 million conversations till date. There are about 2.5 million plus users, and it's available on multiple platforms. So the purpose of the chatbot is to talk about anything that the user wants to talk about, anything under the sun. At the start of it, that was pretty daunting challenge for us, and I'll talk about how we went about it. The main, so one need to realize that a chatbot like Ruuh, which needs to talk about anything under the sun, doesn't need to only restrict to the providing the most relevant response to the user query, but then there are also several other emotional aspects or various needs that the user has that also needs to be addressed, like a user expressing happiness or a user expressing their emotions, they got a job, or somebody is sick in their family, and so on and so forth. So in this talk, I'll talk about the journey of having 2 users on day 1 to 2.5 million users that we have today, and then how did it went about. So before I get into the journey, I just want to talk about my perspective on research in industry typically. So from my lens, how I look at it, I always feel that the research in industry or the kind of research that at least I do is very targeted around what are the problems that the user is facing in the product that we are developing and develop for that. If you have a good quality product, then typically it leads to usage. The usage kind of defines what kind of problems users are facing, and it also kind of generates massive amounts of data that you can then use to kind of really solve those problems or have like data to point out what are the issues and so on and so forth. The flip of this obviously is that when you have a running product, there are several other challenges, infrastructure-related challenges that come up. For example, you need to focus on efficiency, you need to focus on what's the cost of serving per query, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk a bit about that as well. How do you kind of manage that? So I'll talk about 3 phases for the journey of Ruuh. The first phase was when we were getting ready to ship. Then the second phase was primarily about the popularity, how the product kind of started becoming more popular. There was a lot of first-time usage that people were doing. And the third phase, which is the ongoing one, is primarily about deeper user connect and how the utilization has stabilized. So the first phase primarily was to ship the product, right? I mean, so this was heavy, obviously, on research. There were a lot of assumptions that we made based on some user studies that we did, some internal testing that we did. And there were some trends that we observed in the beginning based on which we kind of developed the product. The one immediate thing that we obviously realized when we started developing was that to build a chatbot which can talk about anything, we need to have a module that would answer a wide variety of user inputs. So that was the first kind of thing that we kind of started with. So the first model that we developed was a simple sequence-to-sequence based generative model. There's a lot of work in this area. We kind of developed on Sardoni's work. So this was the work done in MSR. So the idea is very simple. You use a sequence-to-sequence model. You train on a massive corpus of QA pairs, and then given an input, you get the output out. One of the problems with these kind of models is that while they do tend to give relevant responses, they don't tend to give very interesting responses. There's a blandness problem with generative models in general. So that was the first kind of learning that we had, was that um, while these models would generate reasonable relevant responses, our users don't like them because they typically, if they're coming to a product like to chat, they want something interesting out of it. So we quickly moved on to an retrieval-based approach, and we described this approach in one of our papers. So the idea was that we create a big corpus and then retrieve a response which we think is the most relevant. There are some things like context and all to be dealt with, which we kind of describe in the paper. I'm not going to go into details of that. But the key idea was that you have a big QA pair index or message response pairs. Then you do a candidate selection based on the most similar question, and then you rank the responses to find the right response. So in this case, when a user said, "Do you love me?" there were a bunch of response pairs that it hit. And then it ranked and gave your suite as a response. So a couple of challenges that immediately come into picture when you talk about an approach like this. The first one being how the index is formed, right? I mean, you need to form this very big index, which is essentially the language or the way your bot is going to respond. So I have two different versions of. So we used things like Twitter, Reddit, Quora, publicly available QA pairs to kind of mine this. So this is based on tweets and their responses. So you can see very clearly that these are the ones that are in India, and these are the ones that are in US. So the tweets that are from India typically talk about many entities and topics, as well as the language, which is very primarily used in India. For example, Hike is a popular messaging platform in India. Battery Kabab, this is a code mixed language. So it has English as well as Hindi. Hindi is a predominant language in India. Somebody has code mixed and said battery, which is English, and Kabab, which is in Hindi. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister of India sometimes back, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the US tweets, you can see the language is very, very different. Who's your NFL team? In India, no one cares about NFL. Hardly anyone will talk about it. And so on and so forth, right? So the first thing is to kind of have an index which is very localized, which is very specific to the kind of market or language that you're targeting. Because it obviously significantly impacts the way your personality would be of the product. So we were building a chatbot for Indian market, and obviously we wanted sources to be from India. So that was the first thing that we did. The second thing that we did was that because these are like public sources of data, right? There's a lot of things which are offensive. There are several kinds of things that you need to kind of take care of. There are a lot of adult keywords. There are racist comments. There are comments which could hurt certain religions. There are rude responses. You don't want your bot to be very rude. There's obviously a lot of PII information, like email addresses or phone numbers and so on. And then there are also things which it would be very odd if a bot has to say that, like, I will call you, I'll meet you at a restaurant at a particular time, and so on and so forth. So those are the kind of things that you want to clean up from the index. I would like to point out that while initially you could very quickly go through some of these things and clean them up, but this has a very, very long tail because obviously there are so many things which you would not expect the person of your bot to kind of say it. So these are just some examples I want to point out. So this is at the end of phase one, how the product looked like at that point. I'm not sure if it's very visible, but user said something like, I love Coke Studio and some of songs of Arijit Singh. So Arijit Singh is a very popular singer in India from the Bollywood film industry. And it says that, oh, if he was my alarm clock, I would never wake up. I would be having the best Bollywood style dream. So the bot was able to kind of identify Bollywood. It was able to understand who is Ajit Singh and so on and so forth. And that's only possible because of the kind of data that you kind of train it on. Overall, pretty good kind of like quality of responses we were able to get. But then there were some problems as well, which I will now talk about. So yeah, just to summarize the learnings, obviously like curating such a large scale of index is challenging. There are a lot of problems, but you have to do that. That really defines the persona of your bot, and so is localizing the data, and both of them together define the character and personality. This is a kind of very, very important to have like a personality which people can relate to. So it's kind of important that the bot kind of behaves in similar manner throughout the user journey. There's one more interesting thing that I also want to talk about. So many users also exhibited some very specific patterns. Like, people would kind of repeat the same thing over and over again. If they will ask a question like, who made you? They will keep asking, who made you, who made you, who made you, and so on. They would also exhibit some other behaviors, like whatever the bot would respond, they would copy paste it and then input it again, and so on and so forth. So initially, we tried to kind of like solve these things using algorithmically, but it turned out to be more difficult than we thought. And then we eventually ended up having a very thin heuristic-based layer to kind of understand these kind of behaviors and kind of editorially respond to them. So just a reminder that sometimes heuristics works well as well. On to the next phase. So this was the phase where the product was becoming more popular. There were more and more users. There was a lot of first-time usage, obviously, like new users coming into the product and kind of using it for the first time. In my opinion, this was a difficult phase for us as a team because not only were we observing new kind of problems or the kind of things people were talking about, it was also difficult in terms of scale of the infrastructure. And I'll talk about a couple of incidents that happened during this phase. But then it was primarily the insights that we got from the users in this phase that drove the research that we did. Yeah, some of the things that users were telling us, these are actual user statements. You're so stupid, my sister's a pain in the ass, my uncle is in hospital, I'm feeling low, I got placed today, and there's party tonight, and so on. So there are essentially two types of, two categories of problems that you can clearly see. One is people talking about something offensive, and then people expressing their emotions. So I'll quickly talk about two things that we did to address both of them separately. The first, let me talk about emotion understanding. We published this work. So in this, basically, the core idea was that when you try to understand emotions, there is sentiment as well as semantics, and can you like kind of join them together? Very simple kind of architecture. Obviously, the kind of the art lied in forming the training data and kind of like having the right set of data for this. But that was the core idea. Sorry. These are some kind of like once implemented. You can read that my parents feel I'm not good enough for anything I do. It was able to kind of understand that, and so on and so forth. So I think the key learnings here were that users do express a lot of emotions. And it's kind of interesting or important for the bot to kind of understand them for a deeper user connect. But another interesting point is that while we were able to detect the emotions reasonably well, I think responding to them is still a challenge. Like, for example, if your friend is kind of talking about something which is sad, and at some point you need to nod, but then at some point you need to ask a question, oh, how did that happen? How do you feel? And so on. So I think when to intervene, when not to, when to go into this active passive mode continues to be an interesting area of research, and that is something that we still are looking at. Then the next was offensive detection. Again, we published this paper, was the best paper in PAKDD in 2017. The core idea was that you use a CNN to kind of learn the representation of the keywords, and then you have a by LSTM. Again, a very simple model. The kind of details lie in the how you form the training data and so on. So this is one incident that happened, which was very interesting and something that I want to point out to. So there was because Rue was created by Microsoft, it's a big brand. We were very viciously attacked by a hacker group who exploited some of the gaps in our recall, and they kind of like started posting it on Twitter and so on and so forth. This led to obviously a lot of pressure from the PR teams in Microsoft, and we switched from this machine learning model that we had to a very high recall but low precision rule-based approach to prevent any leaks in the system. So I just want to call out that these kind of incidents could impact research. We still use these rules because there's a lot of like fear that these kind of incidents can happen again. So it could potentially kill the research progress, such kind of incidents. The next phase is more about user connect. I think there's more stable usage. There are people who use the product regularly now. They're looking for not just the initial kind of chit chat or hi, hello, but they are looking for a deeper conversation. They also do multimodal inputs typically. It's not just text. We see people putting in images and so on now. And this is the current ongoing phase. So I just want to talk about this conversation. This is a real conversation a user has had, and it's kind of interesting. So they came and said hi, and then Rue said, Pavi, nice, you are back, missed you. So there are a couple of things that have happened here. One, kind of the product, we kind of encoded into the product that how long had this user not chatted with the product. And then also we kind of assigned a nickname to the user. And then in the next sentence, you can see the user said, I like it when you call me Pavi. So this is just like building the user connect. This is not really like any machine learning based system, but just an example of how certain features could kind of increase the user connect. And then I'm learning to speak in English, and bot says, watch English movies without subtitles and try repeating what the actor just said. Just an example of some user connect and deeper conversation. This is another example of multimodal input. So we trained a model which kind of takes the images from the user and not just like kind of describes what is there in the image, but gives a comment on that, just like somebody would do on your Instagram and something like that. So for a picture of cat, it says cute, but my dogs are cuter. For some cake, it said, oh, maybe they can be in my belly, and so on and so forth. So this is just an example of multimodal kind of inputs. You can imagine that speech and videos and all of that kind of is what the next phases would be. So I think a couple of things, right? I mean, one is that obviously when users are trying to establish a deeper conversation or deeper connect with the product, they start also wanting to talk about the world knowledge. And I think it is important to kind of incorporate the world knowledge or day-to-day happenings into your conversation. That is how humans typically talk. That's a challenging area for us. That is something that we are working on right now. On the business side, you also want to start generating some sort of revenue, and it kind of starts impacting the way you think about the product and how the behavior of the product changes. So I think those are two important things to keep in mind. So again, coming back to this question that if user growth peril to research progress or not. So my perspective, I think the data that users generate, very valuable, very useful. Whatever users tell us is the problem that we go on and solve. which is primarily kind of dictated by the massive amounts of data that the product generates. Those the class of problems which are important kind of show up. More often, and those are the kind of things you go and solve, right? Also, sometimes heuristic-based approaches work reasonably well, and are also sometimes very important, like in the incident of offensive that I talked about, that we really had to switch to a rule-based approach for reasons that were not really about user experience. So I think I just leave you with these some very interesting stats. There's a user who has chatted with the product on 237 distinct days for last 1 year. So out of last 365 days, they've chatted with the product for 237 days. On an average, a user chats for about 2 minutes when they start chatting, but then there is one user who has chatted for over 10 hours. That meant about 15,000 messages were exchanged. The bot is the most popular bot in Facebook, and there are a lot of other interesting stats like that, but I have not put all of them. So that's it. Do talk to her and generate more data. Thank you, and if you have questions, I'm happy to take them now. Yeah. Yeah, so I think we started off with first creating a list of topics that we think are offensive. Like in India, for example, religion is kind of a very sensitive topic. So we kind of went through and created a manual list first of the topics that were there. Then we started mining things like Wikipedia and those kind of things to create a list of topics. And then some of the so the approach that I talked about, which used the BILSTM with the CNN to kind of, so that was one thing that we used to kind of filter out data which we thought was bad. Some mix of modeling as well as some human curation is what we used. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so we maintain context in two ways. One is obviously via the LSTM to kind of respond. But then we also maintain context in terms of like how many times have they chatted with us before, the kind of repeat behavior that I exhibited, that they are again and again talking about the same thing, so we will know that it's the same thing. So there are two essentially ways. One is if there is any curated behavior that we are observing, that is one way to kind of think about context, and the other is to think about programmatic, like algorithmically trying to. There's another interesting things, like for example, sometimes users kind of just keep saying okay, okay, okay. You know, so you want to introduce a new topic at this point in time and so on. So there are different ways in which context is kind of used, but I think it's still an active research area to kind of use topics as well as references and kind of use that as a context and then generate responses which are more relevant. So that is still ongoing work. Great. Thank you so much, everyone.